A courtroom, a psychiatric report, a dog named Gustav, and more emotional damage than a family dinner. Laugh if you must. Crying is optional. Chapter 1. The Final Minutes. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic, quiet despair, and that peculiar brand of sterile cleanliness you could never achieve at home, not even with a toothbrush and divine patience. I was sitting by her bed, holding the hand of a woman with whom I shared no photos. We'd never gone shopping, never baked anything together, never had a single heart-to-heart over too much wine. She was my mother-in-law, Hélène, and she was dying, gracefully, if such a thing exists. No drama, no cries, no monologues. Just silence, like she'd rehearsed this ending for years. The heart monitor above her blinked with the stubborn rhythm of a Japanese alarm clock, and I tried to breathe along with it. I failed, miserably. My breath kept skipping, especially when I caught her gaze. She hadn't spoken in over a day, but her eyes still said everything at once. I didn't know what she was waiting for, an apology, a confession of love, or for me to simply shut up and let her go in peace. The doctor entered like a ghost who'd mastered the art of door handles. He was young, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much and still tried to care. He looked at the monitor, then at Hélène, then at me. 1542, he said gently, as though reciting the code to a safe deposit box. And that was it. No fanfare, no light from the heavens. Just the long, unwavering tone of the monitor, the final note in a very strange and quiet symphony. A nurse approached, the kind of woman who always looked like she already knew who was next. She handed me a white envelope. "This is for you," she said, as if delivering a bill for overdue electricity. My name, Claire, was written on the front in handwriting that had never left the year 1973. I didn't open it. I slid it into my bag like a ticket stub from a play you didn't enjoy, but couldn't bring yourself to throw away. Out in the corridor, someone was laughing in the room next door. Maybe they were celebrating a successful surgery, or going home. Someone out there was still living. And I had a letter from a dead woman. One who, in life, rarely spoke, but always looked at you like you had something to feel sorry for. I didn't cry. Not once. It didn't even occur to me that I should. I wasn't exactly sad, just displaced. You know that strange feeling when you walk into a room and forget why you came in? That was me, standing in the middle of someone else's death, yet feeling like I'd lost something of my own. That evening, while making tea, I looked at the envelope again. It lay on the table like a tiny ghost, waiting. I wasn't in a rush to open it. After all, what can someone say when they've already said their last word? And yet, there was something in it, calling to me, not loudly, not urgently, just a quiet whisper. "I'm not finished yet, Claire." That's when I knew. This story was just beginning. Chapter 2. The Key and the Message. Opening letters from the dead has never been one of my hobbies. I prefer dealing with the living, people who can call back if you misread something. But with Hélène, things were different. She had always spoken sparingly, and I suspected her letter would contain about as many words as fit on a teaspoon. I sat at the kitchen table. 3-day-old croissant crumbs were scattered across it, and a mug still held the ghost of this morning's coffee. Add to that an envelope from a recently deceased woman, and you've got the perfect breakfast for a widow no one has yet bothered to pity. I opened the envelope carefully, as though bees might swarm out of it, and in a way, something poisonous did emerge, a heavy old metal key with an ornate head, and a small piece of paper stained on the back with something that could have been wine, or just time. There was an address on it. Normandy. A village whose name sounded like someone trying not to sneeze. And beneath the address, one line, so cold it froze not just my spine, but everything inside me that could be frozen. They never loved me. Let them learn now what it means to be forgotten. That was all. No, dear Claire. No, with love, not even a P.S., just in case. Just that sentence. I sat there with this letter the way a child sits with a diary clearly labeled, "Do not read." Of course, you read it. I looked at the key. It was heavy. Heavy in a way that made you think it didn't just open a door. It opened a fate. Or at the very least, a trunk full of family skeletons. I even smelled it. It carried the scent of iron and decisions made long ago. Helene definitely hadn't bought it at a hardware store. I searched the address online. It was real. The house was real. A stone building surrounded by forest, and the kind of silence that has no neighbors. Exactly the sort of place where the heroine of a Gothic novel would live. Or a mother-in-law who had been secretly writing poetry and chatting with ravens at dusk. I set the key aside and thought, maybe this wasn't meant for me? Maybe it was all a mistake? Maybe she'd intended it for someone else and the nurse mixed up the envelopes? That sort of thing happens in movies. In my life, movies rarely turn on when they're supposed to. I called Jules. Not to tell him the news, he already knew. I just wanted to say something that meant, we have a problem, and it's shaped like a key. He didn't pick up. I placed the key into a box filled with erasers, candles, and various, might come in handy someday, objects. Maybe this was that very someday. Then I looked at the letter again. Those words, they weren't about anger. They were about silence. About what it means to be invisible among your own. For the first time, I felt Helene hadn't wanted to be forgiven or justified. She just wanted to be understood. I picked up the key, turned it in my hand, and said aloud, "All right, Helene, I'll go, but if there are ghosts, warn me in advance. I'm wearing slippers." Chapter 3. The Cold House. The next day, I tried calling Jules again. This time, he actually answered. Probably just didn't recognize the number. I was calling from the landline, the one nobody had used since Grandma stopped sending postcards. "Is she gone?" he asked with the same tone you'd use to ask if a hallway light bulb had burned out. 1542? I said crisply. I even caught myself sounding a little too proud about it. Not that I had any right to feel proud. Just numbers. That's all it was. Well, he paused, like he was searching for the right thing to say, but only found punctuation. She was never an easy woman. That was it. No, how are you? No. Did she leave you anything? Not even a, when's the funeral? Just that. I hung up. Not in a fit of rage, no, just because the conversation was over. Even if he hadn't realized it. I sat down on the couch and stared at my socks. One had a hole in the big toe. Fitting, really? Grief has a way of highlighting all the little things you could have fixed earlier, but didn't. Like a sock, like a marriage. Jules was the kind of husband who came in handy if you needed to assemble a cabinet from IKEA. He could hold a level, tighten screws, and always knew where the manual was. He never got lost in airports, never forgot his keys, and could recite the expiration date of every yogurt in the fridge. But he couldn't talk about anything that mattered. He listened the way you listen to background music, politely, without really hearing a thing. Sometimes I imagined he had a switch inside him labeled "feelings off." And to this day, I have no idea where he kept the remote. Maybe that's why Helen chose me for her final act in this family theater. Not Marie, not Jules, not the lady with pink glasses who dropped by once a month to read her psalms. Me. The wife who, for reasons unknown even to herself, hadn't left. Or maybe had, but hadn't quite shut the door. I looked at the key again. It lay on the shelf like a treasure that didn't know what it unlocked. No instructions, just an address. I wasn't one for spontaneity. I always had a list, even on vacation, especially on vacation. But that night, I fell asleep thinking that maybe, just maybe, it was time to break the rules and go wherever a dead woman was calling me. After all, things couldn't possibly get worse. Although, with my luck, oh, they could. And how? Chapter 4. The Address on Paper. I left early that morning. Not because I was in a rush, but because I couldn't stand being in the apartment any longer. Surrounded by reminders of things that had never actually existed. Love, understanding, a toaster that toasted both sides evenly. The GPS repeated, "Turn left," with the insistence of someone who clearly thought they knew where I was going. I didn't. All I knew was that in my bag there was a key, in the glove compartment, a chocolate bar, and on the passenger seat, my patience, which might or might not make it through the day. The road to Normandy was surprisingly scenic, if you're into cows, fog, and trees that look like they've just come back from therapy. Still, there was a strange poetry to it all. A version of France the tourists never see. Croissant-free, but rich in quiet melancholy. When I finally reached the address, the GPS announced, "You have arrived," and then fell silent. Maybe it too didn't know what to say next. The house sat deep on the property, behind an old moss-covered gate. The number plaque on the fence hung crooked, as if even it had grown tired of holding on. I pushed the gate open. It groaned so pitifully that I almost felt the need to apologize. The house itself was stone-built. Not neglected exactly, more proud in its decay. The plaster was peeling, ivy creeping up the walls like an aging cat onto its owner's lap. The windows were shut tight, like eyelids that had seen too much. A chill ran through me, not fear, but something else, something intimate. Like I'd stepped into a space that had been alone for far too long. The key fits perfectly. The lock clicked, and for a second, it felt less like opening a door and more like pressing play on a cassette labeled "The Past." Inside, it smelled of dust, books, and lavender. Exactly how I imagined the home of a retired literature teacher who secretly writes memoirs no one ever reads. The floor was covered in rugs, last fashionable in the 60s. The walls were lined with photographs, but not of me. No pictures of Claire, no wedding, no holidays, not even a blurry shot where I might have been chewing canapés in the background. On the old wooden table, nestled among a stack of letters and a porcelain teacup holding long dried tea leaves, was another envelope, written in that same precise, time-trapped handwriting, to be opened after my death. Madame Lefebvre, attorney. I sighed. Again, another mystery, another request I hadn't signed up for. I wasn't a detective. I wasn't a romantic heiress with a tragic past. I was Claire, a woman with a chocolate bar in her bag, confusion in her chest, and a set of keys to something long gone. Still, I stayed and closed the door behind me, just in case. Chapter 5. The Hidden House. The house greeted me like an old woman no one had visited in years, with dusty eyelashes, a creaky voice, and the faint perfume of the past hiding in the curtains. I wandered through the rooms without turning on the lights, not out of fear, but because I wanted to hear how silence breathed. It had everything our apartment with Jules never did. Comfort without instruction manuals, objects without obvious purpose, and a chair that creaked not because it was cheap, but because it remembered. I sat down, just for a moment, not from fatigue, but out of respect. Then I made my way to the kitchen. It was ruled by dried herbs, Jars labeled things like Time, 1994, and a kettle crusted with limescale older than my marriage. It smelled of lavender, books, and someone who badly wanted to be noticed, but was too shy to ask. I opened cupboards like I was searching for clues. What had Hélène done in here when no one was watching? Baked cookies? Written curses on napkins? One drawer is stuck. I tugged harder, and out tumbled a keyring and a letter, forgotten backstage in the theater of a life. But no name, no address, just a yellowed slip of paper with a recipe for apple pie, as if to say, even the forgotten once fed someone with love. I climbed to the second floor. In the bedroom stood a bed draped with a patchwork quilt and a dresser holding a black and white photo. Hélène, young, smiling a smile I had never seen in person. Beside her stood a man, not Jules, not Bernard, someone else, unknown. The mystery deepened. I wasn't a spy or a sleuth, but that itchy kind of curiosity stirred in me. The kind you get when you stumble across someone's diary, opened right in the middle. And there, nestled among books and albums, I spotted something that didn't feel like memory. It felt like intent. A wooden box sat on the shelf, simple. I opened it. Inside was a letter, sealed, addressed to Madame Lefebvre, attorney. The envelope read, "To be delivered in person, only after my death, not before." I sat on the edge of the bed, tucking my feet beneath me. "Hélène, you really were the queen of posthumous surprises," I muttered. "If intrigue were an inheritance, you'd have left me a fortune." I looked again at the photograph. Who are you, man with the eyes that made Hélène smile like that? Were you the one she was really waiting for in that hospital room, right until she became a number? 1542? I went back downstairs and sat at the table, the one still holding her dust-covered teacup. Beside it was a small spoon. I picked it up. The metal was cold, solid, real, and then it hit me. This house wasn't a refuge. It was her, entirely, completely. And now, it was mine. Chapter 6. The Call to the Lawyer. There was something particular about mornings in this house, as if the walls woke up alongside me, stretching, yawning, complaining a little. The floorboards creaked under my steps, the curtains swayed gently in the breeze, and at one point, I caught myself humming a jingle from a laundry detergent commercial. Either the house was already working its magic on me, or it was the lavender. It seemed embedded in the very DNA of the furniture. For breakfast, I made coffee in an old enamel pot that had survived more disasters than my personal life. Then I sat down at the table, where yesterday's envelope still lay unopened, the one addressed to Madame Lefebvre. I stared at it like it was a summons from fate, or an invitation to a party you're not sure you want to attend, but you really want to know who's going to be there. I looked up the number. Google told me Madame Lefebvre was an attorney in Paris, specializing in estate law. Fitting. The phone was answered on the second ring. "Office of Madame Lefebvre," said a voice, calm, precise. The kind of voice that belongs to someone whose paperwork is always in order and whose freezer never needs defrosting. "Hello," I began apologetically. "My name is Claire Dubois. I've been given a letter from one of your clients. Hélène. She's passed away." A pause. Then the voice softened, like butter taken out of the fridge 5 minutes before toast. "Yes, Madame Dubois. We've been expecting you." I actually turned around, even though I was sitting alone in the kitchen. "I'm sorry? What?" Madame Dubois left very specific instructions. "You are to come in person. Bring the envelope. And please—" "Here," the voice sharpened just slightly. "Jules and Marie must be present as well." I almost dropped my mug. "Them? Why?" It was her final request, the woman said, and a rather insistent one. I hung up and stared out the window. A strange-looking bush was growing just beyond the porch. I couldn't tell if it was rosemary or a curse. My heart was thudding a rhythm that went, don't want to, scared, curious. Welcome to my life. I tried to imagine how I'd say it to Jules. Hi, your mother's dead, and she'd like you to attend a meeting where you'll almost certainly be uncomfortable. That might qualify as our first real family dinner in years. I reached for paper and began a list. I always make lists when life spins out of control. 1. Find decent clothes. Not, I've been living in a dead woman's house style. 2. Book train tickets to Paris. 3. Call Jules, possibly wear armor. 4. Don't forget the letter. 5. Breathe. I looked at the envelope again. It held no secrets, no promises, just paper that might change everything, or absolutely nothing. And yet I felt it, deep in my gut. This wasn't the end. It was the prologue to something much bigger. And strangely enough, I wanted to know what it was, more than I feared it. Chapter 7. The Awkward Meeting. When I told Jules that Madame Lefebvre insisted on a face-to-face meeting and requested his presence, he was silent at first. Then he said, "This is like in the movies, when your dead mother tells you where to go so you can find out just how badly you screwed everything up." I smirked. I wanted to say he finally developed a sense of humor, but I wasn't sure it wasn't just a nervous breakdown. He agreed to come. Not immediately, of course. First, he asked why he should bother. Then, why was it bothering? And finally, why does anyone listen to dead people in the first place? I didn't answer. Because the moment you try to explain feelings, they stop being feelings and become logic. And logic was in very short supply in this story. The next day, we drove to Paris. He was behind the wheel. I was busy thinking that, in the event of a car crash, at least we'd be spared the encounter with Marie. Brutal, but honest. Marie was already outside the office, smoking and looking like someone had just told her the inheritance was going to the dog. I nodded at her. She nodded back, but with the kind of face you make when a greeting feels more like a slap. "So," she said, flicking her cigarette like a villain in a noir film. "Family reunion? I hope there's wine at least." Jules cleared his throat. Marie rolled her eyes. I silently pressed the intercom. Madame Lefebvre's office was on the second floor of an old building with a marble staircase and an elevator so claustrophobic you could die inside it before getting to the legal drama. We were met by the assistant, quiet as a librarian with tenure. She led us into the waiting room where 2 elderly women were already seated in matching hats. Diana and Eleanor. I recognized them from Helene's stories. Her church friends. The kind of women who probably bring prayer books to the sauna. They glanced at us, then each gave a small nod. The air was thick with the feeling that we weren't about to meet with a lawyer, but were attending an audience with a spiritual guide who was about to deliver her final verdict. I sat between Jules and Marie. We formed a perfect geometry, a triangle made of awkward silence, old resentment, and unspoken whys. Madame Lefebvre entered the room in a flawlessly tailored suit, a folder in hand, wearing the expression of someone who could either conduct an orchestra or perform a surgical procedure without blinking. "Thank you for coming," she said. Madame Dubois left very clear instructions. Everything will be read aloud in the presence of those she named. Nothing more, nothing less. I nodded. Marie rolled her eyes again. Jules adjusted his cuff, and I just sat there, breathing in the air of a room where everything was about to change. Chapter 8. The Will. Madame Lefebvre clicked open the clasp on her leather folder. A sharp, deliberate motion. I saw Jules flinch. He had always had a quiet phobia of paperwork bearing signatures that could change your life. Ironic, really, considering he worked in real estate. Marie sat with her lips pressed tight. She probably expected to hear something like, "Marie, you were the best daughter in the world. Here's the house, the ring, and a poem of gratitude." Spoiler, no. Madame Lefebvre began to read. Her voice was steady, neutral, completely devoid of emotion, which only made the words sound louder. "To my son, Jules, I leave forgiveness he did not earn." Jules froze. I heard him inhale, quietly, like he was about to say something, then thought better of it. Even he understood. There's no arguing with the dead. "To my daughter, Marie, my wedding ring, so she remembers that promises must be kept." One ring, no note, no explanation. But judging by Marie's face, it wasn't just jewelry. It was a blow. A private story. Only the two of them knew. Madame Lefebvre turned the page. "To my friends, Diana and Eleanor, my thanks for never forgetting how my name sounded. 5,000 euros each. It's not enough, but it's sincere." The hat ladies nodded in unison, like members of a church choir. Not a flicker of surprise on their faces. They knew friendship is rarely paid for in money. But sometimes, even euros can feel like affection. Then came a pause. Not a long one. But in it, the air in the room suddenly thickened. Even though the air conditioning was still humming. Madame Lefebvre looked at me. "And to my daughter-in-law, Claire, everything else. The house, the accounts, investments, policies, archives, personal belongings, everything that remains of me, because she was the one who listened when I was silent." Silence. As if someone had removed the batteries from every person in the room. Not a single sound. Not even from the hats. I didn't move. Not from shock, but because it felt like something inside me had turned off and then slowly flickered back to life, brighter than before. Jules stood abruptly. His chair screeched so loudly it might have earned applause had we been in a theater. "This is a mistake!" he snapped. Marie stood too. Her bracelet shook on her wrist, or maybe it was the anger. "She wasn't in her right mind. Everyone knows that. Claire's a stranger, practically an ex." Madame Lefebvre's face didn't shift by a millimeter. She calmly laid down the paperwork, one document at a time, like cards on a poker table. A psychiatric evaluation, a notarized video of Madame Dubois reading the will aloud, the signatures of 2 witnesses, legal authentication. "Everything is in order," she said. "The will is incontestable." Jules sank back into his chair. Marie did not. She stood rigid, like a character in a Gothic novel who's just had the family brooch stolen. I sat and held myself, together like a cup of very hot tea. Because if I spoke, everything would spill. Chapter 9. The Explosion. If silence could be nuclear, then that room had just witnessed a detonation. No flames, just glances exchanged like gunfire, heavy breathing, and a tension thick enough to spread on toast. Jules sat with his fists clenched like a schoolboy caught cheating on a test. Only this time, the test was an inheritance. The teacher was a lawyer, and instead of apologizing, he muttered a low, stunned, "What the hell?" Marie remained standing, as if upright posture alone might help her assert dominance. It didn't. She looked like someone had slipped nails into her favorite shoes. She was always a bit... Marie struggled to find a word that didn't sound like crazy, but also didn't drift into saint. Withdrawn. "That's not a crime," Madame Lefebvre said dryly, "and not a diagnosis." I suddenly wondered how many times in the last few years Jules and Marie had described their mother using only one word: difficult. As if personality could be a reason for distance, a convenient curtain to hide behind. She wouldn't have left all that to Claire, Jules muttered. Seriously, she wasn't even her daughter. I'd had enough. At least I answered her calls, I said, calmly, barely above a whisper, but everyone heard. Marie shot me a look, the kind usually reserved for expired yogurt in the back of the fridge. You were playing caretaker. That's not the same. And were you playing daughter? Diana and Eleanor, silent until now, church statue still, glanced at each other, then nodded. Apparently, they knew how to give approval outside of scripture. We've said all that needs to be said, Madame Lefebvre announced. It's all recorded. Marie, you are, of course, entitled to file a challenge, but I wouldn't advise it. There's nothing in this will that's legally vulnerable. And I must point out, Madame Dubeau took specific precautions. Video testimony, medical certification, witnesses. She pulled out a tablet and played the video. Hélène appeared on the screen, older, calm, sitting in a chair I now recognized, from that very house in Normandy. I leave my estate to Claire, she said, because she heard me, not the words, but the silence between them, and that, believe me, is far more important. The video ended. Jules lowered his head. Marie was still standing, but now she looked less like a person and more like a sketch. I didn't feel victorious. This wasn't a triumph. It was something else. Strange, a blend of relief and sorrow, because someone had just entrusted me with an entire life, and I wasn't sure I ever really knew it. We stepped out of the office. The sun was shining. Marie lit another cigarette, as it might save her. Jules said nothing. I'll drive you back, he muttered. Thanks, I replied. But I think I'll stay in Paris for another day. Do you have somewhere to stay? Yes, I said. In my own life, for the first time. Chapter 10. A Letter. Without Forgiveness. I left Madame Lefebvre's office without looking back. Not because I was strong, but if I had turned around, I might have seen Jules and Marie standing there, not as grown children, but as confused school kids who'd been forgotten after class. And that knowledge was far too heavy for the pockets of my coat. I walked along Boulevard Haussmann, where the window displays smelled of new perfume, credit, and foolish hope. People rushed past, confident, busy, clutching their phones like they were trying to steer their lives through sheer will. And in my bag was a letter. From a woman who seemed to have learned that you can't always control your life, but you can, sometimes, end it gracefully. I stopped at a little cafe, ordered an espresso and a croissant, like a scene from a bad film about new beginnings, and only then did I open the envelope. Inside, a single sheet. No greeting, no date, no, Dear Claire. Just one sentence written in that same strict handwriting, tilting slightly to the left, like the words were trying to slip away from the hand that wrote them. Forgive no one. Let them ask. Let them bow their heads, and then just smile and walk away. I read it 3 times, then once more, not because I didn't understand, but because I couldn't quite believe it. This wasn't a blessing. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a directive, a practical manual for action or inaction. And I wondered, when Hélène wrote this, who was she? A wounded mother? A forgotten woman? Or simply someone who had waited too long for words that never came? My croissant had gone cold. The coffee had turned bitter. And there I was, holding a piece of paper that somehow weighed more than everything Jules had ever said to me. I remembered once, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, Hélène had asked me to bring her mint. Jules had said, "She's just being picky," trying to make you feel obligated. But when I brought her that small bunch of mint, she looked at it like I'd handed her the sun in a cloth bag. We didn't speak. We just sat. She smelled. I watched. And maybe that was our best conversation. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. Not because I wanted to keep it, but because I didn't know where else to put it. Throwing it away felt impossible. Leaving it out felt like hanging a sign that read, "I hope you all understood everything." As I left the cafe, I bumped into a woman in her 70s. She dropped her bag and her oranges scattered across the pavement like tiny golden planets. I helped her gather them, and she said, "Thank you, dear. People rarely bend that close anymore." That line, "people rarely bend that close," lodged itself in my mind deeper than the will ever had. Maybe that's all Helene had wanted. Someone, anyone, even her daughter-in-law, to bend down, not out of politeness, not out of duty, but out of attention. Out of silence that meant presence. I stepped back out onto the street and realized forgiveness isn't weakness. It's a privilege. But asking for forgiveness, that takes strength. And I wasn't sure if Jules or Marie had that kind of strength. Chapter 11. First Steps in a New Home. I returned to Normandy on a Monday. It felt like the perfect day to begin a new life. No holidays, no promises, just warm air, road dust, and radio songs about love, as if it were the national sport. The house greeted me as if nothing had happened, as if death, the will, family drama, and the phrase, everything else, belonged to another world. And here, it still smelled like lavender, dust, and peace. Honestly, I didn't mind. I changed into an old sweater, the kind that didn't make me feel like a wife or an heiress, but like a person with hands, a heart, and a suitcase full of questions with no expiration date. I decided to walk through the house like a real owner, a proper one, with a cup of tea in hand and the gaze of someone trained in the science of coziness. In the corner of the living room, I found a stack of notebooks, the cheap school kind, but each cover neatly labeled 1979, 1980, 1981, on and on, as though someone had been recording a census of solitude. I sat on the floor and opened the first one. The handwriting was neat, sometimes ink, sometimes pencil, but always with that same slight leftward tilt. Still, Helene. Jules said he can't come, he's busy. I said I understand, I always understand, even when I don't want to. The next one read, Marie sent a birthday card, no signature, just, "Happy birthday, Mom, not even yours." Once, she was mine, completely, a tiny bundle breathing on my shoulder. Now, an unsigned card. I kept reading them, one after another. It was like breathing in a scent long forgotten. Tobacco, mint, disappointment. There were even food notes. Made soup. No one came. Ate it for 3 days. Somewhere in the middle was a small note. Set a Christmas table for 4. Habit. No one showed up. Ate fish alone. Didn't even salt it. For the first time in a long while, I cried. Not sobbing, not theatrically. Just sat there as tears quietly rolled down my cheeks like they were reading along too. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally stood up, it felt like I'd just spent an evening with someone I'd known all my life. Even though, while she lived, we were almost strangers. Almost. I went to the kitchen, made instant noodles, a humble first step toward strength. Set the bowl down on the old wooden table. I remembered one Christmas, the year I still believed in us. I gave Jules a book about shared travels, full of stickers and blank pages for memories. He gave me a massage voucher. It wasn't until later that I noticed it had his name on it. "Oh," he said, "maybe you'll book me a session. I've been so stressed." I smiled at the time, but inside, something clicked. like a lock you know will never open again. I spoke aloud, as if Hélène were sitting across from me. I don't know why you chose me, but if you really hoped I'd understand, I'm trying. I truly am. And at that moment, a dog howled outside. Or the wind. Or maybe it was laughter. Who knows? I sat there, eating noodles, and for the first time in years, I felt not just inside a house, but, in some small way, home. Chapter 12. Bernard's Letter. On the third day, I decided to open the chest. It sat in the corner of the bedroom, tucked under an embroidered throw, as if someone had been hiding it, not from people, but from time, or from those who never learned to ask. I tapped lightly on the lid first, as if to say, I'm one of yours, don't be afraid. Then I opened it. It smelled of mothballs, old paper, and a summer long gone. Inside were blankets, photographs, books with receipts as bookmarks, and a single envelope, worn as it had traveled through several eras. The name written in careful script, Bernard. I sat on the bed, holding it with both hands like a bowl of warm broth. The room went quiet. Even the creaky floor held its breath. I opened the envelope, carefully, as though it contained not words, but pressed flowers. Hélène, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there. Maybe I left, maybe I came back too late. I know you're angry. You always knew how to be angry, loudly, proudly, but you also knew how to love the same way. Don't leave the children something that will rot their conscience. Leave it to the one who understands. Don't take revenge. Live. I still remember your hands. Bernard. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe a love confession, maybe an explanation, maybe just an apology. But this was manlike, a little incomplete, a little stubborn, but honest. And still, my throat tightened. Because these lines held a story no one had told the children. Or maybe they had. But only the version where Mom was difficult and Dad left because he just couldn't take it anymore. I wondered if Hélène really had been angry, but she kept that letter. Moved it from place to place, survived it, reread it. Maybe he was the one she waited for. Long past hope, but still, to the very end. I looked again at the signature. Bernard. A man I never met, the one Jules referred to simply as, Dad left when I was 11. And for Marie, he was always somewhere far away, like a geographical error. I went to the living room and opened another diary. 1993. Bernard didn't come, didn't call, no explanation, just silence. I asked Jules, if I were the one to leave, would he feel it? He shrugged. I put Bernard's photo in a drawer, not because I forgot, but because I remember too much. I closed the diary, and I understood then. Hélène hadn't left me in a state. She'd left me memory, fragmented, bruised, sometimes bitter, but alive. I stood, poured myself a glass of wine, the one I'd found in her cellar, labeled 2007. Not because I'm a wine person, but because I want to believe that one day I'll write someone a letter too. No blame, no demands, just this. I still remember your hands, and that will be enough. Chapter 13. Feigning Care. When Jules called me 3 days after the will was read, I nearly dropped my phone into the soup. He hadn't called with such urgency even when I'd forgotten his birthday, though, technically, it was his fault. He forgot mine, then accused me of dramatizing. But, oh well. Hi, he said in a tone usually reserved for a date invite or an IRS audit. I was thinking, maybe we could meet. Just dinner, no talking. Well, almost no talking. Almost no talking. That sums up our marriage for the last 7-8 years. But I said, "Okay, because sometimes it's easier to say yes than to explain why you say no." He arrived in Normandy with a box of chocolates and that look people get when they've lost a chess match but refuse to admit it. "You look good," he said. "And you look too surprised for it to sound like a compliment," I replied. He grinned, probably thought it was flirtation, or defense, or both. We dined in the living room. He ate like someone who knew. After dessert, there was going to be a request. And sure enough, the dessert came in the form of his long monologue. "We could rethink everything. Life is short. Mom changed us all. And naturally, money isn't important. So if I give everything to you tomorrow, you won't mind?" I asked, looking straight into his eyes. His pupils had a running calculator in them. "Well," he stumbled, "that's not what I meant." "Of course not," I nodded. "You just happen to remember that I now have accounts, a house, and arguably a folder with documents you're desperately missing." He went quiet, too fast. Then he tried to switch the subject. Asked how I was feeling, how the house treated me, and if I was okay being alone. I answered, "I'm fine." What I was scared of was the time before, when you're not alone, yet you feel like no one cares. He said, "I'm thinking about us, the future." I nearly choked on my wine. "Really? Are you mentioning us for the first time after I inherited everything you didn't?" He stood up, moved to the window, took a pause worthy of a movie scene. All that was missing was the thunder. "Marie thinks you're simply playing at generosity. And you?" He turned. His gaze was softer, or maybe I wanted it to be. "I don't know. I want to get to know you again. Without anger, without hurry, like in the beginning." I smirked. "At the beginning, you were late to our first date and said you forgot. Back then, it seemed sweet. Now it feels like a symptom." He sat down again. We drank tea, no sugar, but a heap of doubt. 2 days later, I got a letter from the court. Marie filed a lawsuit, contesting the will. Reason? Doubt as to the mental state of the decedent. I folded the paper, sat by the window, and said to myself, "Well then, welcome to reality, Claire. Here, chocolate is bitter, and care comes with a surprise." Chapter 14. The Trial. The letter from the court looked as ordinary as an electricity bill. The content, however, was a little more toxic. Marie had decided her mother couldn't have been of sound mind if she left everything to me. And now the French Lady Justice was tasked with deciding whether I was worthy of inheriting someone else's solitude. I didn't sleep the night before. I tried to remember everything I knew about laws, wills, and Marie. Especially Marie. She had always been excellent at being offended, even if it meant offending herself first, and then everyone else. Jules called and said, "Don't take it personally. It's Marie. She's just overwhelmed." Interesting way to handle being overwhelmed. Filing a lawsuit, I said. I, for one, eat chocolate. He went silent. I guess he ran out of comforting phrases that don't work. On the day of the hearing, I wore a simple black dress. No jewelry, no makeup. I decided to be invisible, so the court would focus on the matter at hand. And the matter was simple. Helene wasn't mad. She was just tired of being polite. The hearing took place in a small courtroom that smelled like coffee, dust, and other people's hopes. Marie showed up in a black suit with a silver owl brooch, apparently a symbol of justice, and vigilantly watching someone else's estate. Madame Lefebvre was calm, as always. She produced her documents wrapped in a folder with corners sharp enough to cut illusions. "Here is the psychiatrist's report," she said. "Miss Dubois voluntarily submitted to an independent evaluation. Here's the video recording of the will reading. Here are the written statements of 2 witnesses. And finally, She brought out a tablet, video recordings made several months before her death. The judge was elderly, face-wise enough to listen without issuing verdicts prematurely. He nodded, and they played the recording. I felt Hélène's voice with my skin. Calm, a little weary, but clear, like morning frost. My daughter visited for the first time in 8 months. She asked about earrings. When I said no, she called me selfish. I tried. I called. I waited. For many years. And then I stopped. I chose Claire because she came, without asking, without calculation. Just came. When the recording ended, there was a silence so deep I swear even the owl on Marie's brooch lowered its wings. The judge jotted something in his notes. Then he announced, "The claim is dismissed. The will stands as valid. And..." He paused, as if adding a personal note. "I hope that this case teaches you, madam, not only the legal details, but also what family means." Marie turned pale. Her lips tightened into a line like a worn shoelace. Jules didn't look at either of us, just stared at the table. After the hearing, Madame Lefebvre handed me a receipt. "The court orders Marie to pay all legal costs." I nodded, thanked her, and then left the courtroom. And, unsure whether to cry or laugh, bought myself a croissant. Croissants are always right, because if a trial truly is a fight, then victory can feel sweet, at least a little. Chapter 15. The family breaks apart. The trial was over, but the family was not. It simply fell apart like an old pillow. Quietly, with a dusty swoosh, spreading all across the bedspread. And I was the one left to tidy up the dust. At first, Marie disappeared from all the chat groups. Even the family one, where in recent years there had been only Christmas greetings and the occasional recipe no one ever cooked. She just removed herself from conversation, from the town, from everything. Then the rumors arrived. She quit her job, or was let go. Colleagues don't like people who sue their own mother, especially when that mother is already dead. Her former boss, it turned out, was friends with one of Hélène's church pals. France is a small country. Gossip travels faster than telegrams here. Jules tried to keep up appearances. He turned up at a business dinner without a tie, but with the face of someone who suddenly had not just lost an inheritance, but the very ground his self-worth had been hiding beneath. A couple of weeks later, I saw a notice in the newspaper. Small, in the bottom right corner. Family dispute. The children of the late Hélène Dubois challenged the will. The court sides with the daughter-in-law. No photograph, but the name, yes, black on white. I clipped it out. Not to put on a wall. I'm not a collector of other people's downfalls. Just folded it and stowed it in a drawer. A reminder that even silence sometimes hits the press. Jules called the next day. "Did you read it?" "Yes." "Do you think everybody now sees us as monsters?" I paused. "Depends on what you were before. If you were wonderful people, now monsters. If you were monsters, well, that's fair." He went quiet, then said, "Can we start over?" I didn't laugh, not because I didn't want to, just because it wasn't funny anymore. "Jules, we've started over many times. Each time, right where I felt superfluous again." He remained silent. Again. That was our most consistent conversation in years of marriage. I said, "I'm moving to Normandy. Officially?" "You're serious?" "Absolutely." "And us?" "We'll discuss that through lawyers. Everything will be polite, no surprises, just the way you like." Pause, then he said, "I didn't expect this. Neither did Hélène. But she still left me the key." I hung up. Not in anger. In the calm I'd never had around him. It felt like I'd finally taken off shoes that were too tight and realized I could walk barefoot. The next day, I printed the divorce notice, slipped it into a folder, signed it, and that evening, in the house that used to be Helene's and now is mine, all the lamps turned on. I switched on music, made myself pasta, and for the first time in many years, I ate not in silence, but in peace. It was just a little thing, but, believe me, it was enough. Chapter 16. The Fall. Jules arrived in Normandy wearing a gray overcoat that made him look like the office guy being called into the accountant's office with the line, "You're let go," politely. He stood on the threshold with a face full of regret, as though someone had eaten his last hope and left no crumbs. I opened the door. He said, "I need to talk to you." "Only if it's not about love." "No, about money." I sighed. Ah, yes, 21st century romance. We sat in the kitchen. He stared into his cup as though it were a tarot spread. Maybe it held the answer to what he'd broken and still needed to fix. I stayed quiet. I didn't want to gloat, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him either. "The bank," he began. "I'm being squeezed. Marie and I had a joint collateral. After the trial, well, you know, we're in the red. I need just $5,000 to cover a payment." "And Mom?" I asked. "Did she just need 5 minutes? Just one call, one card. Did you ever find that?" He lowered his eyes. "I didn't think it would come to this. Loneliness isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's just your name missing in someone's day." He looked at me like he was hearing something he'd never understood before. Not about bills or weather, but about something that can cut. "5,000, Claire. I'll pay you back, I swear." I stood up and walked to the living room. I pulled a small, weighty envelope from the drawer and came back. I placed it in front of him. "This isn't money. This is everything I had left, aside from memories. These are her letters. Have you ever read them?" He opened one silently, read a few lines, and his face changed, softer, or maybe more real. "Why didn't she speak?" he asked. "Because she waited, and then she got tired," I replied. "I didn't know," he said. "You know what hurts?" I sat opposite him. "She didn't ask you for anything, and you still didn't give, and now you ask me." He didn't know what to say. I felt a moment's pity for him, almost, but not exactly. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I nodded. Then I stood. "Jules, I wish you the best in sorting this out, honestly. But not at my expense, not at hers, not at the expense of the memory you refuse to keep." He rose. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. And rightly so. Sometimes silence is the best finish. When he left, I closed the door. Slowly, no theatrics. Just put a period on a long sentence that never became love. Then I made tea, no sugar, because even in life, there must be a little bitterness. To remember the taste. Chapter 17. The Legacy. When I made the decision, there were no trumpets, no doves flying in, no wind rising. The coffee machine even needed a plug wiggle to start. It was just morning, an ordinary one, under a gray sky with the thought, maybe I'll try. I sat by the window, a notebook of Helene's on my lap. There, between a burnt pie entry and reflections on when children grow indifferent in themselves, was a line. If there were a house where no one is afraid to say, "I am alone," maybe I would have come too. I don't know what snapped inside me or knocked. Maybe it whispered, "And you, Claire, what's stopping you?" That's how the idea came, to turn Hélène's house, her fortress of solitude, into la maison d'Hélène, a house you can come to when you've lost someone, something, yourself. A house where you'll be heard, even if you speak between the lines. I went to the town hall. The mayor sat behind his desk, the expression of someone usually fielding complaints about rubbish cans, not new ideas. When I told him what I planned, he raised an eyebrow as if I'd proposed turning the house into a cabaret. A support center for widows and the elderly? And for those who don't yet know which category they belong to, I added. He thought, then said, "If you're not asking us for money, I'm in." I laughed. I only asked for a trash bin and a little silence to begin with. The bin we can give. Silence is harder. Work began. I drafted announcements, posted flyers, called charities, and learned from volunteers whose voices held kindness even through telephone wires. Someone donated old armchairs. Someone else, a kettle and 11 mismatched cups, each different, like the people we anticipated. Our first lunch happened in the rain. 5 people came, 2 ladies, 1 widower, a young woman whose husband left, and 1 grandfather who simply said he was looking for somewhere quieter. We ate roast chicken and talked about old French films in which everyone smokes and no one is happy. It bonded us. I was about to serve dessert when the door burst open, along with a gust of wind, and in ran a puppy. Small, fluffy, eyes wide with surprise, ears far too large for his head. "Sorry," yelled the young woman with the backpack, following it in. "He wouldn't stay in the car. Thinks he knows where decent people gather." Meanwhile, the puppy bounded up, sniffed my shoes, sat at my feet as though he knew this was his place now. "His name's Gus," she said. Gus, after Gustave Eiffel. Dreamer, stubborn, and terribly afraid of being alone. I laughed. For the first time in a week. More people began arriving. Someone brought a pie. Someone else, a poem. And someone just brought silence. And that silence was precious. Because here, no one asked, "Are you still crying?" They knew, if you're crying, you're still alive. I hung a sign at the entrance. La Maison d'Ellen. Here you may be yourself, even if you don't yet know who that is. I wasn't becoming a saint. I still swore at the stove, mixed up the bills, and sometimes thought, why did I start this? But then someone left a note. Thank you for the quiet and the warmth. And I felt lighter. One evening, after everyone left, I made tea, sat in Hélène's armchair, and whispered, "You knew, didn't you? You didn't take revenge. You left me the chance, yourself, memory, and that, a reason to think." The house creaked, maybe from old age, maybe in agreement. And in that creak, I heard not loneliness, but life. Chapter 18, Echoes. 6 months after the opening of La Maison d'Ellen, I received a call from Université Paris-Sorbonne, secretary of the sociology department, a voice like a metro announcement, but kinder. "Madame Dubois, we're preparing a conference on social isolation. We've heard of your project. Would you agree to speak?" I asked. "Are you sure you need a woman whose diploma lies somewhere between a cookbook and a maiden name passport?" He laughed. "Sometimes practice matters more than theory. And you, madam, have both. Plus lavender on top." I agreed, not because I love public speaking, because I've sat too long in the audience, and suddenly it felt like maybe I should step up to the microphone. I set the alarm early. It didn't help. Gus woke up first anyway, as though he was worried about my first public outing. He now confidently believes he owns the house, though in reality, he's just a furry alarm clock with teeth. Today, he brought me a sock. Someone else's. I don't want to know where he found it. On conference day, I wore the dark blue dress, the same one I wore to the trial. It had become my transformation suit, like a superhero's. Only instead of a cape, an old notebook in my bag, and a warm scarf in case my heart wanted to hide again. The audience was almost full. Young students, older researchers, someone with a tablet, someone with a notepad, and someone whose face already carried sadness. I began simply, "My name is Claire, and 6 months ago, I inherited not money, but loneliness." Someone froze. Someone lifted their gaze. I talked about Hélène, about the house, about letters, soup, an empty Christmas table, and a bunch of mint that outlived more marriages than some people. "We often say, 'It's fine,'" I continued, "when we actually want to be left alone. But sometimes we say it so often that it becomes true." I looked around, and suddenly I saw a woman in her 60s with eyes hiding unsaid conversations. She nodded, quietly, barely noticeable, but I felt she wasn't there by accident. La Maison d'Hélène isn't a charity. It's simply a place where no one says, "You're strong, you'll resist." Because you don't always have to resist. Sometimes you just need someone to be there. After the talk, a few students approached me. "You spoke as though you were talking about me," said one, who was 20. "So, loneliness is not an age, it's a state." The memory woman approached last. "Thank you," she said. "I lost my husband 3 years ago." I stayed quiet. I smiled. Everyone told me, "You're doing great." But inside, I was like an empty suitcase. You just gave me the handle back. I hugged her, without words, because hugging is also a form of speech. When I returned to Normandy, the house smelled of bread and dust. And I thought, maybe the real mission isn't to change something, but to name the pain by its real name. And not to be afraid. I wrote a new phrase on the board at the entrance. Sometimes family isn't about the blood connection. It's about the ones who stayed when everyone else left. And I signed it. Hélène and Claire. Chapter 19. The Book. It all began when Laura showed up, one of those regulars at La Maison d'Hélène, a woman with hair the color of ash patience and a voice suited for reading bedtime stories, even if no one listened. "Claire," she said, holding a notebook, "you have to write this." "What exactly?" "Everything, this whole story. Hélène, the will, the trial, the soup, everything." "Laura, I'm not a writer. At best, I'm a correspondent of my inner monologue." "Exactly. So write it how you think it. No frills, simply, the way you do." I tried to joke, said my literary feats ended at shopping lists. Laura just nodded. Then she left me a pen, a real ink pen, the kind you use to sign letters with important words. And that's how it began. In the evenings, between a cup of tea and the grocery report, I wrote, at first cautiously, as though testing the water. Then with abandon, because pain doesn't like short sentences. I wrote about Hélène, about the will where forgiveness was a line without inheritance, about Jules and his belated revelations, about Marie, who never realized that being a daughter is not an obligation, but a chance, about the house that wasn't a refuge, but a person, about loneliness that doesn't shout, but whispers. The title came by itself, Hélène's Letter, the words I've waited my whole life for. A publisher turned up surprisingly fast. A friend from the local library forwarded the manuscript to an editor she knew. Then came the call, the offer, the editing that made me cry for 3 nights straight, and 1 night from joy. And finally, the book. When I held the first copy in my hands, I somehow remembered a childhood dream of being a ballerina. Then realized I'd become someone far more balanced, someone who knows how to stand, even when everything inside is dancing. The book sold, at first in Normandy, then in Paris, then across France. I didn't become famous. I became recognizable. And believe me, that's much calmer. People wrote letters, Lots of them. One man, 82 years old, wrote, "I didn't know I could still feel something. Thank you." On the radio, the host said, "This is the kind of book after which you call your mother, or your wife, or yourself." Sometimes I was invited to meet readers. Almost every time someone asked, "Did you really inherit all this?" I smiled and answered, "No, I inherited not everything. I inherited what was left after someone's silence." When the promotional tour ended, interviews, cakes with my name and cream, I returned to the house, sat in Elaine's armchair, opened the last diary, and added my entry. Today, I wrote the ending. But maybe this is just the beginning, and a warmth filled my soul. A few weeks after the book's release, I received an envelope. No return address, paper thin as a premonition. "I read your book. You protected her better than we did. Marie." No signature, no date. But I knew this was her, I'm sorry, spoken the way she could, not face to face, yet still said, "And Jewel?" One time, I saw him at the station. He stood by a kiosk, holding the issue of a magazine with a review of my book. He didn't buy it, just looked, shook his head, as if seeing his life printed between the lines. Then he walked away. Quietly, almost beautifully. Chapter 20. The Final Gift. The anniversary of Helene's death came quietly. Not because I forgot, but because in this house, we no longer counted losses. Only gains, even if they were strange ones. New people, new habits. New sense that loneliness wasn't a sentence, just a pause someone once placed between us. I woke up earlier than usual. Outside, it was gray. So gray, even the birds looked like they were in a black and white film. The kitchen was the same as always. The kettle groaning, the stovetop stubborn, the radio silent because I forgot to turn it on. But inside, something hummed. 1 year, a whole year. As if I'd only just held her letter yesterday, but I was already a different me. I put on Elaine's old coat, the one with pockets full of buttons, receipt scraps, and, somehow, a chestnut. It still smelled of her, like a memory no detergent can wash away. I walked to the oak tree. It stood behind the house. Big, mute, magnificent. Helene always wrote about it in her diaries. If I were a tree, I'd be that one. I'd stand and watch the ones who didn't stay walk past. I placed a small plaque under it. Simple. No gold leaf. No grand phrases. It read, "You weren't forgotten. And now, neither am I." Beneath it, I planted a lilac. Because that was her scent. Not lavender? No. Lavender stayed in the house. Lilac stayed with me. I stood and watched as the wind kicked up dust and the leaves danced without rhythm. And I realized, maybe the most important part of inheritance isn't the bank accounts, the square footage, or heirloom rings, but the ability to say, "I remember you," even when everyone else falls silent. We sat in the garden a long while, me and Gus. He looked at me like he knew all my stories, even the ones I hadn't told. Then he yawned, rested his head on my knee, and snored. No fear, no nerves, just the quiet trust of someone who knows they belong. A few days later, I received a letter. The envelope was old, the handwriting curved. Inside, a few lines. "Hello, my name is Louis. My mother was Jeanne. She used to live in Rouen. I think maybe I'm Helene's grandson, and I'd like to know who she was." I placed the letter on the table. My heart skipped, then found its rhythm again. "Hello, Louis," I said aloud. "Come in, we've got so much to tell you." And I went to brew tea, because stories are better told when there's a cup in hand and someone beside you who remembers. He arrived 2 weeks later. Tall, with Helene's eyes, just younger, more lost. We sat in the kitchen. I served tea. He was quiet for a long while. Then he asked, "Did Grandma really talk to herself?" I smiled. "No, she was just tired of no one talking to her." He nodded, then pulled a notebook from his backpack. "I write too. Sometimes. Please don't judge if it's bad." "Only if your handwriting's messy," I teased. "We're very strict about penmanship here, and in that joke, there was more welcome than in 100 apologies. Thank you for staying with me until the end. You've waited, you've lost. You've hoped too, haven't you? Tell me your story, the one that hides in quiet evenings and unspoken words. I'm reading. I'm here, like Helene once was for me. And if you feel like it, leave a message. Softly, truly. I'll hold your mug while you speak."